Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Community webinar. My name is Declan and I'm delighted to be joined by Eric Riz, who will be talking to you about Making SharePoint Strategic. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSB and our hashtag is ESPC14. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Eric in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Eric Riz. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Declan. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's doing great today. Give me 1 second here to show my screen to you all, and we will be online very quickly. There we go. Declan, if there's any issue with what you're seeing on the slides, just give me a quick note.
No, that's all okay, Eric. Fire away.
Perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on the European SharePoint webinar of the day, depending on where you are in the world. It's either morning or afternoon. I'm in Toronto, Canada today, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking to everybody. Thank you for taking the hour out of your day to spend with us. As Declan mentioned, you are certainly welcome to provide your questions, thoughts, comments, insights. You can do that on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @RizInsights, and certainly connect up with me there and on other social media as well. I look forward to seeing your feedback. So as I mentioned, speaking to you from Toronto today, I'm the Executive Vice President of Concatenate. Concatenate is a Toronto-based company, and we are an ISV and an SI focusing on SharePoint, and we've built a variety of systems around real estate within the SharePoint platform as well. From the SI perspective, we also offer a number of products and services to accelerate your SharePoint experience. I'm a two-time MVP. I've been working with SharePoint for over 10 years now, and as I mentioned socially, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter @RizInsights, and you can catch all that information up on my blog at ericriz.com. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, making SharePoint strategic. What is this thing called SharePoint, and how do we make it strategic? A number of years ago, when SharePoint was released into the community, there was a lot of time and effort spent on document management. SharePoint was document management, and whatever people thought document management was, that's what SharePoint was. It became a file share. It became something that people really used to simply have a front-end portal set up for their documents, and that's really not strategic. A document management system is not a strategic element of your organization. So today we'll be talking about what is SharePoint and how do we make it strategic. How do we define an enterprise application, and what does an enterprise application mean to our organization? We'll talk about communication as far as discussions and deliberations go. We'll talk about some tactical strategies and stages to get you in the right place to succeed within your organization. And finally, we'll talk about some next steps so that we can move everyone forward. Again, if you have any questions along the way, please fire them off in the chat window that you should be seeing. One thing to start off is I'd like to discuss your area of responsibility. And this is a very important part of being. You need to know, and we need to know, where you are within your organization in order to have you succeed. And it's important that everyone resonates with one of these titles. There are obviously other titles that come up. One that comes to mind very quickly is the title of end user. If you've hopefully seen me speak in front of an audience at a conference, then you've seen me ask the question, how many of you in the room are end users? And the answer to that question typically gets about a quarter of the audience to raise their hand. The reality, of course, is that everybody in the room is an end user. If you use SharePoint on a daily, monthly, weekly basis, on an hourly basis, if you've used it once, you are an end user. And it's important as we go through the strategic conversation to resonate with one of these titles as well as the title of end user, because it's critical to know who is using SharePoint, what they're doing, what their responsibilities are, what their expectations are for the system. If I was to put a system together that was just focused on document management, and I put that online, and you were expecting a portal environment with a lot of heavy workflow and a lot of business process, then you would be obviously very disappointed in the results that you were receiving. So ensuring that we have those requirements set up, ensuring that we have the information that you need from you as end users is critical. So why you're here today, hopefully, why you're here today, is because you've recognized somewhere along the way that SharePoint as a product, as a project, and as a platform is not a slam dunk. There's nothing slam dunk about SharePoint. And you've recognized, you see and you realize that you need corporate involvement and you need teamwork, as well as a lot of in your organization to get it all right. And that's the reason why I've generated this topic as something that I've been speaking about in my travels this year. And I look forward to continuing it this year as I go out to some other shows, and you'll see which shows I'll be at later on in the slideshow. As I said off the top, SharePoint is not just a document management system, and this is something that I really cannot stress enough. If you are looking at an existing SharePoint system and you have something around 2007 or 2010 that you've implemented, the likelihood is that the conversation in the organization originated from the need or the requirements internally for a document management system. And there are many document management systems out there, not just SharePoint. Document management systems are really a cornerstone of organizations today. People recognize and realize that the need for document management and having a succinct document management system is very critical. And people have implemented SharePoint from a variety of perspectives. But remember, the idea here is to have SharePoint act as the nucleus to your organization, the center of everything that your organization is all about, from a line of business, productivity perspective, from a workflow perspective, from a business process perspective. It's all about making you and making your organization stronger, better, faster than before your implementation was completed. So if you're looking at SharePoint as just a document management system, you're almost selling yourself short. Now, as the system itself, the question is SharePoint strategic? Well, the only way to answer that is to ask the question, what is strategy? And the answer to the question is really difficult to touch on. It's difficult to point your finger at. To me, my favorite quote here is the one that's at the bottom of the screen right in the middle. Strategic positions should have a horizon of a decade or more, not a single planning cycle. And that's one that I want to speak to specifically, because if you look at Microsoft and you look at Microsoft's vision, the life cycles of their products, you're almost assured that the products that Microsoft has in the market today have a minimum of a 10-year decade, a 10-year span in order for them to be supported, in order for them to be online and live. So if you're looking at deploying SharePoint 2013 today, you can be assured that, and reassured, that by 2023 at a minimum, Microsoft will still be supporting SharePoint 2013. Those of you on April the 8th this year that were on Windows XP know that that was the cutoff date, the end of life date for support for XP. Now, it doesn't mean that the product just stopped working. It means that the updates and the services and the support from Microsoft ceased on that day. So ensuring that you're looking at your strategic position within the organization, you want to make sure first and foremost that you are deploying a system that's going to be there when you need it. You want to make sure that you're deploying a system that's going to be, excuse me, you want to make sure that you're deploying a system that's going to be aligned with your strategic position of the organization. That means you need to look at your roadmap. You need to look at your business plan. You need to look at your technical and IT components in order for you to ensure that SharePoint is a strategic fit for your organization. do not just look at SharePoint as a tool set. Look at it as the platform that Microsoft intended to be. So strategic SharePoint, and you'll see this in the next slide visually, strategic SharePoint is all about having SharePoint implemented as the enterprise system that Microsoft intends it to be and that the larger community intends it to be now. With any type of deployment, there's a very large conversation around adoption. How do we queue the system and modify the system as we go through our implementation and as we go through our usage of the system to ensure that it's adopted correctly by the organization? Because I'm sure we all know, and I'm sure there are a lot of people nodding around the world right now at the screen, that you can deploy the best system, but if it isn't adopted properly by the organization and it hasn't been deployed based on the requirements of the system and of the organization and of the needs of your business users, then you're going to have a large issue as far as the long term of that product goes. If it's not adopted the right way, then we have larger issues. So as we look at that, there are many systems, and integrating your SharePoint world, your SharePoint environment, whether it's from an ERP, a CRM, a PLM perspective, or any of the systems that you see up on that slide, any of those systems can work with SharePoint. They can integrate with SharePoint. They can strategically impact your bottom line. My dream is to have a SharePoint system in place and running where the data that you're seeing is data coming from other systems, but it's being housed and being modified within SharePoint. And that's a term that I use, which is called single source data. Single source data means, from a front-end perspective, all of the information that you're seeing is being run through SharePoint screens and a SharePoint familiar user interface. But the source of the data can go back to any of the systems that they originate from. What that means is you have much better uptake from an end user perspective, an adoption perspective, and a change management perspective, because you're not required to train your 1,000 users, or whatever your number is, your number of users, on all of these 8 systems that you see right there. All you have to do is train them on SharePoint, how to use SharePoint, and have the data come in and of itself. Of course, within those integration systems, we have that gap. We have this performance gap because those systems can't talk to each other. And what we need to do to try to get through that is identify some of these challenges. Perhaps it's from a critical data silo perspective. Perhaps information is fragmented and disjointed. Perhaps your HR information isn't getting to the people that need to see it, or that inefficient cross-company business processes such as email, phone, mail, whatnot are disconnected as you move your organization forward. If you see those as a challenge, then there's an opportunity to bridge that gap and to use SharePoint and to configure SharePoint as that tool, as that system that's going to become the extended value of both line of business and the extended value of SharePoint. And naturally, the bridge between these systems is going to be SharePoint. As I said, we want SharePoint to be implemented and deployed as that nucleus, that center conduit of the organization, and we want to move all of your data and all of your thoughts and planning from just system of record to really system of engagement. So we want to make sure that everyone is involved and really put forward a message of the connected organization. And that's what that might look like if you look left to right through Skype, through OneDrive, Link, email, and Yammer. Now, as we get through the next slide, the question to all of you is, do you have a SharePoint-specific journey? Is there something that you have put together within your organization for your deployment where you have looked at your implementation, your project, whatever you would like to call your I'm failing for the word, so I'm going to say project again, for your project, and have you put together a journey of what you want and what you expect SharePoint to do and be for you as you've gone through the life cycle of the system? If I was standing up in front of an audience right now, the likelihood is that people would be smiling at me, but nobody would really be nodding up and down. And that's typically what I see and what I get, because people think, yes, Eric, you tell a good story, and certainly we'd love to have a SharePoint journey, but we don't have one. We didn't have one. We implemented SharePoint for a specific need based on a specific skill set or a specific requirement that a group had, and we were unable to really align to a journey. So what I'm going to do right now is show you our SharePoint journey slide, and it looks exactly like this. The SharePoint journey, and this is all strategy, this is all part of the strategic conversation, the SharePoint journey looks like this. We begin with executive buy-in. This is where you sit down with the executives in the organization, your C-suite, if you will, and you have conversations around the strategic commitment, the alignment that's going to be required for our deployment, and the roadmap of what SharePoint is going to do for the organization. This is very similar to the strategic topics that we spoke to just off the top today, where we want to make sure we brought in the business plan, the organizational plan, the objectives, the roadmaps, the IT plan, and have these conversations initially from an executive perspective to ensure that everybody is involved and committed to the project. Once you have that commitment, you can go a very long way, and you can go all the way through to the strategic operations pillar that you see on the far right of that screen. Following executive buy-in, that's where we go into portal adoption. Portal adoption is the deployment stage where you have SharePoint deployed as that centralized, understood, trained, and adopted portal for your users. That's where you start to push general concepts within SharePoint. So you push things like internal communication, knowledge management, finding the information that you need, locating the information that you need in a portal environment that is familiar to you and to everybody who is looking at and consuming this information through SharePoint on the one connected system that SharePoint is meant to be. When and once that portal is adopted throughout your organization and across your organization, throughout that enterprise, you can start going through the Information Hub. The Information Hub is, and this is my favorite box on this slide, transforming to a place where work gets done. Too many organizations start off by, as I mentioned off the top and I've been mentioning throughout, having SharePoint deployed as a document management system. And what that is really using SharePoint as an enabler. And in this context, the enabler means you have SharePoint online, and you basically use it as a referencing system where, yes, we need to find this particular piece of information, this particular document, we're going to go into SharePoint to find that information. And while that was fine in 2007, today in 2014, it is not as respectful. It is not as important. It is not what we want to do to be the organization that we think we can be, to have people using SharePoint the way that we really know that they can. So we have transformation to a place where work gets done. Don't use SharePoint as just a DMS, as just something that's used as an advanced file share. Challenge your organizations to use SharePoint as a place where work gets done. Use SharePoint to take the critical workloads of your organization and make them that much lighter. Use workflow. Use the critical business process definition. Use a lot of the integrated tools and third-party tools that we know are available to ensure that all of the heavy lifting of your organization is being done within SharePoint. So if you are going to SharePoint to get your task completed, that's when you'll know that you've transformed it as a place where work gets done, and it's no longer seen as just a place where we go and get a document. After that, I'm going to stop going through this slide, because beyond dashboarding, critical process, automation, and strategic operations are three things that really don't have much as far as play in this discussion right now. I've seen too many customers start off on the BI dashboarding side. What do we want SharePoint for? Oh, we want to see some stuff on a dashboard. That's not the way to sell SharePoint. That's not the story that we want you to go back and tell to your organization. So ensure that you start off with executive buy-in, portal adoption, creating that enterprise-wide information hub to ensure that you can truly have that foundation you need to then build your BI and dashboarding. Do the BI and the advanced dashboard that you need to get the information, because until you have the information in the system, you really can't do anything around dashboarding for it. Until you have that information in the system, you can't look at really automating your critical processes around the enterprise. And you certainly can look at it as the strategic, running your strategic enterprise-wide operations throughout the organization. The question that we have here as we move into the next slide is, what are your business goals, and have you created an IT strategy? This is something that we took, pardon me, from the first slide. I'm sorry, from the previous slide in the first pillar to nail one of these points completely. And when you go through your IT strategy, one of the things that you always want to keep in mind as you start talking at an executive level, at a requirements level, at a strategic level, is this slide. And it's one of my favorite quotes. Henry Ford famously said, if I had asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And obviously, we're not all about faster horses here. We're dealing with an enterprise system that is going to make a massive impact to our organizations, and we want to be sure that it is adopted and seen as such by our organizations. Do not undersell the value of change management and adoption when you start to have your conversation. These are all critical and important things. When you go in to tell your story and you're going to explain to your organization, whether it's at an executive level, whether it's at a user level, whether it's at a one-to-one level with a peer, you want to make sure that you're creating a story that makes sense to the organization. What is this thing that we're trying to do, and how do we strategically create something that's going to impact our organization long term? And a strategic way of looking at it would be something like this. Our strategy is to have the following elements. So look at the right-hand side of the screen where you have that SharePoint wheel, if you will, not the old wheel. This is a different wheel. This is telling a story of what our enterprise application is going to look like. We're going to give Exchange. This is an Office 365 slide as far as the slides go. We're going to have Exchange across the organization. We're going to have advanced file sharing. We're going to have a connected story through link and Skype. We're going to have technical support. We're going to have a financially backed SLA. We'll have line of business systems coming into it. It will be on any device, in any browser, anywhere. And that is what we're going to do as far as our goals and goal setting really are created. The thing that we're missing, what we need you to be involved with from an end user perspective, is what that impactful process is going to be. We can do everything within the project. We can strategically implement everything on the right-hand side of the slide, but the impactful process, the creation of that process that's going to make a difference in an organization is something that we need you to be involved in. And your commitment there and your involvement there is something that's going to be required and necessary for us to deliver this properly. In your organization, a question to now take back as you see the slide that talks through the way to strategically create the value, the vision, the mission, and the objectives for the project is, how is SharePoint introduced in your organization? I imagine many of the people on this webinar today currently have SharePoint within your organizations, currently being used, and that's a question to take back with you. How is SharePoint introduced to the organization? I've seen a lot of companies that have done the introduction correctly through the required change management, the required adoption, the required requirements, and the necessary conversations that we really recommend to get SharePoint implemented the correct way. But I've also seen a lot of organizations that have done it through almost by, I would say they've almost done it by I'm trying to find the right word here, but it's basically doing it by accident, where you're sitting in a meeting and you're having a conversation and you suddenly realize, oh, hey, we have this system that's been implemented and it's now going to do these things. So think about it, and if you fall into the last category, then we want to make sure that you go back to look at that journey slide. It's never too late to come back to the journey slide. It's never too late to come back to the C-level support. And C-level support doesn't just mean executives, it means figuring out who's leading the charge. If you're sitting in a room talking about SharePoint, remember that having 8 people in the room for 1 hour, 8 people in the room for 1 hour in a meeting means you've just wasted one single day of effort. And we want to make sure that You know exactly who's leading the charge, and we want to maximize the effort that everyone's putting through. So if you look in that room and you can't clearly identify the person who's leading the charge, you have a systemic issue with your implementation, and we want to make sure that you're able to strategically make that definition going forward. So ensure that you're able to figure out who the person is who's leading the charge. In some projects, in some organizations, it's very clear. In others, it's not as clear. But understand as you're looking strategically at your IT strategy that SharePoint is, it's really a pillar within your strategy, but it is not the strategy itself. You can't look at it and say that SharePoint is your strategy. SharePoint is a tool. SharePoint is 10% of your solution. And it's up to you, and the onus is on you as the organization to use the 90% of the system that is going to be queued and modified and needs those requirements and those end user feedback, to drive the right system and put something in place that's really going to be impactful for your organization. So make sure that you know who owns SharePoint. Is it a specific department? Is it IT? Is it the business? Is it a person who maintains ownership for the system? We need to ensure that we can point to that person and clearly identify the person who is involved and the individual who is going to really drive this project, drive this implementation, own this product as we move through our organization, as we move through our implementation, and not just the implementation, but the long-term maintenance of the system from a high-level perspective. One of the ways to do that is to ensure that we've created and defined the value that we need. That definition and creating that value is critical to your long-term strategic goal. And I should just take a quick aside here and just tell you that as your speaker today, one of the things that I have, one of the tools that I have at my usage here is I can see an audience view, so I can see when 100% of the audience has the slide up on their screen. And one of the reasons why I'm pausing in my introductions is to make sure that everyone has that on their screen. So I can now see it's at 100%, and I can navigate to the slide. So from a definition and creation perspective, we want to be sure that we have determined the principles and goals of the system. What is SharePoint going to do for us? How is it going to be maximized? What critical business processes are we going to create or modify or identify within our organization? How can we classify our business information? And there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of information on all of these topics, but there's a lot of information out there on classifying your business information, on taxonomies and folksonomies, and ensuring you are looking at and are able to find information properly. I have an example that I use on stage where I talk through the difference between finding something and searching for something. Too many people go online or they look at SharePoint search as a place where they can go and search for something, or as a place where they can find something. So my definition is something like this. From a search find perspective, if you are searching for something, then you don't know what it is that you're looking for. If you're just trying to find something, then you're looking for something very specific. So if I'm in my closet and I'm trying to find my blue sweater, am I trying to search for it or am I trying to find it? Well, if I have a blue sweater, then I'm just trying to locate it. I'm just trying to find it. But if I don't have a blue sweater and I'm trying to search for something, then somebody's going to commit me very soon because I'm looking for something that I simply don't have. And too many people look for their business information in a very similar type of way, a very similar category of finding your business information. So make sure that you are looking at what you currently have as an organization and what you're going to be putting into and be stressing the system with as far as a search find perspective. Next, we have a developed education strategy. And an education strategy is a very important part of your system, as is the next bullet, which is the ongoing plan. Developing an education strategy means you want to tell your users how they're going to use the system and how they're going to be supported through the usage of the system, which means When you deploy on day one, you're going to have some power users, you're going to have some end users who have no idea what it is that they are doing and what requirements they're going to need to fulfill. And that's very important because we want to make sure that they are empowered and enabled to use the system. So have an education strategy in place which is going to drive that usage. That might be some external training, that might be sending people to a third-party training company or bringing somebody in to train them. It could be a train the trainer through some lunch and learns. But whatever it is, make sure you have that pillar in place. Next, make sure you have an ongoing plan to not only look at the auditing of your principles and goals, but also auditing how people are using and adopting the system and how the education strategy is going to be, or it is being used as you move yourself forward. The next slide is defining the enterprise application. And defining the enterprise application is a critical step in this strategic conversation. Organizations today look at SharePoint as a tool and as something that is used within organizations for a variety of reasons. Many organizations have done it based on the specific needs, and by done it I mean implemented, but based on the specific needs of a specific problem, a single problem that a particular business group has. And then SharePoint lives there, and other business units within the organization are able to tap into SharePoint and customize it for their own needs. By doing that, I would challenge you to say that that is a non-enterprise deployment because you haven't built a common set of tools for the entire organization to leverage. You've built based on the needs of one particular area, and in so doing that, SharePoint becomes a black box because too many people in the organization are unsure of what the purpose of the system is. They're not certain on what they should be doing or how they should be doing their job and functioning from a job and job management perspective. They aren't certain what the system does for them and how they can use it. And in most organizations, the result of that is non-usage. They do not use the system. And if you deploy and people aren't using it, you have a very critical issue on your hands, and that's something that needs to be identified early and often. Next is about setting expectations. One of the examples that I like to use is going to the ER, going to the doctor. When you go into the ER to the doctor, the first question that the doctor will ask you is based on your need sensitivity. They'll ask you, where is your pain? And they'll ask you questions that lead to a solution based on the experience of that individual, and then they'll work on a success strategy to get you healthy and back out there. When you're looking at your requirements, when you're looking at solving a need of a particular business unit or a particular area of the organization, you want to make sure that you ask very similar types of questions in a very similar way. Don't start off by just deploying a particular piece of functionality and assuming that it's going to fit the requirements of that individual or that particular business unit. Start off by identifying the pain. If I was in a conference right now, standing on stage, and I asked you, how many of you have a pain, a business pain that you need to use SharePoint to solve, I'm sure all the hands in the room would go up, and they have in the past. So there is a pain, there is something that we're going to be solving, there's something that we're going to be doing to manage an issue that you currently have, and you want to make sure that you begin by identifying that pain. When you look at your success strategy and your solution, you can ensure deployment and performance based on setting some metrics. And setting metrics means something like this. It means going ahead and having a statement that says that by November 2014, we're going to have 78% of our employees using SharePoint for all HR functions. There's very little within this slide, there's very little within that statement that's a miss. Right? Everyone understands what we've put up on this slide. We said that by a very specific period of time, we're going to have a very specific percentage of our organization that is going to use SharePoint for a very specific reason. And setting those metrics as the output of creating a plan is very critical to your long-term success. We want to make sure that we create metrics that have impact. We want to make sure that we do the work that's involved from a metric perspective to claim and commit to performance measures that make sense for our organization. We want to realize what's valuable. You may realize that migrations aren't the answer if the information that you're moving isn't strategic. That's one of my favorite things to say. There is an adage, I guess you could say, where you have something like lipstick on a pig, and the reality is, if you don't have good data and you don't have good information, then migrating that information, which is bad data or dirty data, into a brand new net new system is not really helping the organization. So make sure that you triage, make sure that you strategically look at everything that you have from a triage perspective and identify the biggest pain and how you can best alleviate it to start to define the strategic objectives of what your implementation, what SharePoint is going to do for you, whether it is a brand new implementation or whether it is an ongoing implementation or an ongoing project that you have. If SharePoint has been in your organization for 3 years, if you were one of the first adopters of SharePoint 2013, so let's say 2 years, then it's never too late to go back and look at things from a strategic perspective and try to improve and push yourselves to the next SharePoint level. Using what you have is a big part of that. Ensuring that you've used the Office components that are in place for you, that you have OneDrive for Business, that you have, as I mentioned earlier, single source content, and guiding principles that make sense for your organization is critical. There's a lot of conversation today about social. And is social strategic? I get this question all the time. Eric, is social strategic? Is it a strategic part of my organization? And I really can't answer that from a broad scale. I can't just simply say yes, or I can't say no. What I can say is that social is a very important part of business today. One of the first things you heard both Declan and I say off the top today was make sure that you engage with us socially. Make sure that you reach out to us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Yammer, and going through that process is a strategic step because it's giving you engagement at a one-to-one level, but it's something that from a social perspective we want to make sure that we nail within our organization. If social is important to you, then make it important to your organization. Develop a strategy that for SharePoint and for the social tools that you have in place to deploy enterprise social, and make those definitions and those declarations around what needs to happen in your organization for that to be the de facto standard for how your projects get run. If Yammer is critical for you and you want to have the integration of Yammer, you want to have it on your SharePoint screens and you want to see that type of information, then make it so. But ensure that you've gone through identified it as part of the journey within each of your organizations. All of that begins with communication. And we want to make sure that everybody is communicating effectively and ensuring that you have delivered the right value to each of your end users and each of your C-level stakeholders at the end of the day. So that's very nice for me to say, and it's very easy for me to say from a communication perspective, but make sure that you recognize that, of course, your strategy may not always succeed, and having the backup in place to ensure that you have an easy way of identifying your successes or your failures and floating them up and down the stream so that we can identify what's gone well and what may not have gone as well from stage to stage. Make sure that you talk about if failure was something that you did have within your project, make sure you identify the reasons why. It could have been lack of understanding. It could have been that too many people simply got busy. It's possible that a crisis unfolded, but whatever it was that derailed you, make sure that you're able to identify that and use it as a lesson learned going forward. Remember that when you're communicating, the alignment is all in the messaging. Satisfaction is equal to expectation plus performance. My apologies that the E did not appear there. But make sure that you have messaging in place. Make sure that you strategically discuss what SharePoint means to your business, what's going to make that difference, how performance is going to be measured, how it will all be realized, and then ensure that you are delivering the messages that your organization wants to hear. The question that I get a lot is, how can we be strategic? How, as an organization, can we be strategic? Good question. There's no I in team, but there is in RAID. And you want to make sure that through alignment, your value is realized and the value of SharePoint is realized. Look at everything from a productivity perspective. Look at SharePoint from an employee productivity lens. If you don't know how to create a strategic SharePoint value for your organization, think about it from this way. How can I best empower and drive employee productivity within my organization? That's the question. Sit down with an employee and say, sit down with an end user and say, hi, how can I make your job better with the tool? And they'll tell you exactly the heart of the matter, the meat of their issue. And it will be up to you to define the business solution that's going to solve that problem. Make sure that you've used these types of strategies and tools within your organization for end-state success. Quick question, and this is one that speaks to and moves towards adoption, change management, and strategy. Now, of course, I have no way of knowing what your answer is going to be, so I'll assume that you all got this right. Which of these systems, which of these applications was the quickest to the 1 million subscriber mark? Was it Instagram? Was it Foursquare? Was it Dropbox? O365? Could have been Facebook. You know, Facebook is fairly popular. Which was the first one to get to the 1 million subscriber mark? It was actually Instagram. Instagram had took 2.5 months to reach 1 million subscribers. And the reason I show this slide is because you want to recognize that your adoption and getting people to use the system is something that's going to take time. And having that as a strategic component, as a rung on the ladder, if you will, is quite critical, easy for me to say, pardon me, quite critical for you to set the right objectives both within your organization and with your end users to commit to and to see that your organization has put the right timelines and the right time frames up for your SharePoint adoption. As far as getting tactical goes, we want to make sure that your organization plans for long-term strategic performance. Remember that it's not the technology that matters, it's the content. I talked about lipstick on a pig a few slides ago. Make sure that you have the right content in place, the right business processes in place for long-term success of SharePoint. Plan a single source content strategy. Single source to me means that changing a field in a document or in a spreadsheet or a Word document, whatever it's going to be, making any type of change, whether it be from a front-end level within a document or a back-end level within the metadata or the taxonomy of a document, that should be made once in one place, and it should filter through and be pushed down to the rest of your organization. If you have to go to modify taxonomy within 5 or 10 different documents in order to make one change, you do not have a single source content strategy, and you need one. Ask rather for the support that you need to get everything done. That doesn't just mean from a tactical level, from an individual end user level. It means from an IT perspective, a business perspective, an end user perspective, a training perspective. And remember, align with your team first. Bring your project team together and explain the planning steps you're going to go through. As far as strategies and next steps go, we want to make sure that you understand your strategy. We want to make sure that you have defined the goals required and communicated both those goals and expectations throughout your organization in order to gain that type of alignment. That's what's going to drive long-term strategic value out of SharePoint for your organization. Defining the goals, communicating them broadly, and aligning throughout the organization. In summary, we want to make sure that you are strategic. Begin by identifying the pain, by aligning yourselves to a journey, by strategically committing to the goals and objectives that your organization needs to succeed. Make sure that you create the value that your organization needs through SharePoint. Have this high-level picture of what SharePoint is going to be, and that will allow you to stay focused and hopefully to execute flawlessly. As I lead up to my thank you slide, I want to draw your attention to a few things. First of all, socially, please connect with me on Twitter at RizInsights or at Concatenate. We are at WeConcatenate. Drop me a note through my blog at ericriz.com or ericriz/li. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, please tell me that you loved and enjoyed the webinar today, and I'll be happy to add you on LinkedIn. From an upcoming event perspective, I'll be at Dev Connections in Las Vegas, September 16th, next month. From a couple of days from now. SB TechCon Boston is also in the middle of September, the 17th through 20th. SharePoint Fest Denver, September 22nd to 24th. And I'll be doing the keynote address at SharePoint Saturday Cincinnati on October the 11th. So if you're in the greater Cincinnati area, please be sure that you drop by on Saturday, October the 11th. There are a number of events that are after October the 11th, but I didn't have enough room on this slide to throw them up there, so please hop on to ericriz.com and make sure that you had a chance to peek at where I'll be throughout the rest of 2014. I want to thank you very much for taking the time today to listen to me and see everything that Making SharePoint Strategic looks like. I believe we have a few questions that are in the queue, so Declan, if you want to go through those, I'll be happy to answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation. And just to deal with some questions, first question I have here for you, Eric. How do you see social expanding as a strategic topic?
How do I see social expanding as a strategic topic? Well, I spoke about that a bit in the latter half of the slides. I think that social is really something that, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out. Social is the next generation of computing. And I think that we need to take the moniker of social away, and we need to really focus social not on something that organizations see as just Facebook reincarnate. We need to focus on social as really the next generation of communicating. Social is being looked at and is being used by a lot of organizations